see, no country in history has succeeded without having a strong navy and a strong navy to protect sea lanes of communication. You've seen it with the British Empire, with the American Navy and the economy, and of course China. Now the Indian Navy gets about 18% of the defense budget, where there's been a case that has been made for the Indian Navy to go beyond 20%. China has actually been cutting down on its soldiers, its land forces, and focusing more on its air force and on its navy.
Pakistan has underlined 4 red lines, where it says that if those lines are crossed, that is when it would consider launching a nuclear weapon.
Right.
And one of them is the economic strangulation of Pakistan, which would happen if the Indian Navy were to successfully blockade the Pakistani coast.
Geography dictates history. And in the case of Pakistan, as you mentioned, and I've written that it's a cul-de-sac. It's a 1,000-kilometer long coastline. It's very strategic. It's really important for Pakistan's survival because literally 90% of its maritime commerce, its energy supplies come through this coastline that's very close to the oil-rich countries of the Gulf.
China is rapidly expanding its navy. It's now bigger than the US Navy in terms of the number of ships.
Right.
But technologically, obviously, the US Navy is far ahead. There's no match, obviously. You've had Chinese so-called research vehicles coming towards the Bay of Bengal. Welcome to Inner Defense. This week, we focus on the Indian Navy and how a dead cow led to the Navy's famed 71 war game engagement. That's maybe a joke, but we actually want to focus on the Indian Navy and specifically the two-front scenario, where on the one hand, it sort of outclasses Pakistan, where on the other, it faces a steep challenge from China and its expanding navy, which is now the largest in the world in terms of the number of ships it has. And for this, who better than Sandeep Unnithan, who in the defense circles is known as the go-to person when it comes to all things Indian Navy. Isn't it, Sandeep?
Yeah, that's what they say, Dev. Good to be back, but...
Yeah. We've kind of briefly discussed this when we talked about submarines, but when it comes to three armed forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, how is it that you developed a deeper passion for the Navy vis-a-vis the Army or the Air Force? Did it just happen naturally, or was it something, or like you said in the submarine episode, it's because you were a water baby?
Water baby. Yeah, well, the naval background did help, but also when you study history, I think I developed a passion for naval history. And the fact is that India was what it was over 1,000 years back because we were trading out at sea, and we had a very exceptional empire, the Chola Empire, which ruled for 1,000 years, which we are not taught enough about. And they surged forth and they created this, fascinating empire, and they expanded through trade, our soft power, cultural influences all across Southeast Asia, partly because of the fact that the Cholas steered to the sea. And I think, I believe this, that if you are to become a power of consequence, you have to be a maritime power, and not just a military maritime power, but also a commercial power. You must have both aspects of being a mercantile power and a military power. No country in history has succeeded without having a strong navy and a strong navy to protect sea lanes of communication. You've seen it with the British Empire, with the American Navy and the economy, and of course China. China today is where it is, and it realizes it needs to be where it wants to be with a very strong navy of over 500 ships. And the Indian Navy, we've known that. India has realized the fact that if it is to grow as a nation, it needs a strong navy, it needs a strong mercantile marine, and all of these are happening now as we speak, Dev.
Yeah. So on this episode, actually, I wanted to talk, that's exactly one of the reasons I want to talk about the Indian Navy, because I think that when it comes to military discourse in India, it doesn't really come up very often for discussion. India has the coastline that is bigger and longer than its land borders with either Pakistan or China. Yet the Indian Navy is the smallest of the three forces. And we've sort of discussed briefly about this on two episodes previously, links to which will be there in the show notes. And I would really urge our listeners and viewers to sort of refer to them as well. Is the submarine episode and the Great Nicobar episode, the Great Nicobar Project episode, where we talked about the importance of the maritime power that we're talking about. But this episode will focus solely on the Navy and its two adversaries, so to speak, Pakistan Navy and the Chinese Navy. To start with Pakistan. The idea came from something that you wrote last week for our website, India.in. We'll have that article in the show notes as well, is why the Pakistan Navy basically fears the Indian Navy. Now, when I look at the map of the Arabian Sea, when I look at the map of India, Africa, Pakistan, it's pretty obvious that Pakistan, geographically speaking, is not in a very advantageous position, right? It's almost like you wrote, it's a cul-de-sac. Like, it doesn't really have a lot of space at the back for its navy to stay away from the Indian Navy. At the most, it can sort of escape towards the Gulf of Oman and then go deeper towards Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iran. But that's not really. That's more of a. When I look at the map, to me as a layperson, that seems more of a hiding position than any sort of defensive or offensive position, which makes me think that it's always going to be very easy for the Indian Navy to sort of blockade Pakistan if it comes to that. So before we talk about the real world implications of this, in terms of, we'll go back to the 65 war, we'll talk about the 71 war, we'll talk about Operation Sindoor as well. Before we do that, tell us about this geography and how it puts Pakistan in a very sort of disadvantageous position.
Oh, good question, Dave. And the thing is that geography dictates history. And in the case of Pakistan, as you mentioned, and I've written that it's a cul-de-sac. It's a 1,000-kilometer long coastline. It's very strategic. It's really important for Pakistan's survival because it literally 90% of its maritime commerce, its energy supplies come through this coastline that's very close to the oil-rich countries of the Gulf. And it also needs the ports, Gwadar, Jiwani, let's not forget Karachi, the main port, Bin Qasim. All of these are very critical to Pakistan's economy, but for several reasons. The primary one being the geography itself. And the second one, of course, is the fact that India's geography is very suitable for naval operations, given that it's, if you look at the Indian map upside down, it's a peninsula that's jutting out into the Indian Ocean. And this is an advantage that has been long understood by empires that have ruled in India, the maritime empires like, of course, the Chola Empire that I mentioned, and the British. Now, when the British came, for instance, they turned the Indian Ocean into a British lake. They were on the Indian coast, and from there, they built up a series of forts, like Singapore was their eastern fortress, and Aden was the western fortress. They controlled all the access points into the Indian Ocean, and they ruled that way for almost 2 centuries, until they were then displaced by the American Navy, which is today the most powerful navy, extraterritorial navy in the Indian Ocean region, which operates primarily from Diego Garcia and, of course, in Bahrain and several other bases in the IOR. But the most powerful regional navy is, of course, the Indian Navy. And like I mentioned, geography favors us, the fact that we have a peninsula, we have bases on both sides, we are able to disperse our fleets and at the same time converge them to a point of action. And that point of action in the last couple of decades has usually been the coast of Pakistan, first in 1971, and then of course we saw it in 2025 where shots weren't fired, but the fact is that the Indian Navy and the government of India has underlined the vulnerability of Pakistan. If Pakistan talks about just 2 fronts, that they're worried about their Afghan front and the Indian front, the government of India is saying there's a third front that you have to be very worried about, your southern flanks, which is if you don't have a strong navy which protects your sea lanes of communication, which is able to protect your mercantile marine, then you're effectively a landlocked country. And that is what happens to Pakistan usually in conflicts like we've seen in 1971, where you had East Pakistan, you had West Pakistan. Both of them very important maritime boundaries for both. And you had the sea lanes of communication between the 2 provinces that actually were the only link connecting East and West Pakistan. And once the sea lanes of communication were cut, you had these two provinces literally floating, and independence of Bangladesh was a foregone conclusion because you could not run away. All your soldiers were literally bottled up. That entire garrison fell, and they were captured. The same thing was with the West when the Indian Navy, literally rained missiles down on the 4th of December and subsequently destroying something like 4 warships, 4 merchantmen. It created the impact that it wanted, which is to literally every foreign ship that was to come in or go out of the coastline of Karachi stayed away. They stayed away from the Pakistan coastline, converting Pakistan literally into a landlocked state, which could not rely on the seas for its sustenance. It could not get supplies. It got completely bottled up. And that is when it kind of relies more on its neighbors like Iran, for instance, for overland passage. But as we know that it is the maritime route that is the fastest, the most economical way of getting your goods and your commodities and your energy lines and all that, which is why nations all over the world, they invest so heavily in oceanic trade, and which is why India as well has built up all its port infrastructures and all that, and it's planning big ports like the Great Nicobar Island that we've discussed in the past. So this is literally, a geographical curse for Pakistan when it looks at its at the way it's been structured, and it's not been able to invest substantial resources to beef up its navy, where it has the same problem in a sense like India, that you have a large maritime boundary relative to your borders, but because your disputed boundaries are all on land, it's the land or the continental, theory that kind of prevails over the maritime, dimension. And because you have contested land boundaries, a greater share of resources are taken by the army and by the air force. And that's the case with both the Pakistan Navy and with the Indian Navy. Now, the Indian Navy gets about 18% of the defense budget, where there's been a case that has been made for the Indian Navy to go beyond 20%. China has actually been cutting down on its soldiers, its land forces, and focusing more on its air force and on its navy. And the reasons for that are not far to see. If you see the kind of warfare that is, if you're not getting into a kind of war of attrition like Russia has in Ukraine, then the fastest and the swiftest way of both initiating a conflict and terminating one is the naval realm and, of course, the air force. So China is focusing more on air power and on the naval aspect, and we need to be doing the same as well. We've been underinvesting, actually, if you ask me, on both the naval side and also on the Air Force side.
India is blessed with a natural sort of build that is suited for maritime power, because I can think of, when you were answering that, when you were saying that, I could think of myself back in my childhood when I was playing Age of Empires. I don't know if our listeners and viewers have ever played that game. And for a second, if you forget the Pakistan threat, then I could so easily imagine that, my Maharashtra and Bengal coast would be where I would build my ships, because they're deep inside, they're safe. And like towards the south, where you have Kerala and Tamil Nadu, you have Lakshadweep, you have Andaman Nicobar Islands, and that would be my sort of offensive attacking point. So I'd build my ships back in the base, send them out, and then launch attacks from there, and
of course, and
conquer the world.
Right. Of course, well, we have no world domination.
No world domination.
We just want to be where we are and kind of prevail over the region. But
Stay peaceful.
The fact is that the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, don't forget, Dev, and we've discussed that in past installment of your show, where we've spoken about the Great Nicobar Island project. I mean, this is literally God's gift to India, the fact that you have an island chain that is so close to Southeast Asia, and actually, if you build that up, it actually brings you as a Southeast Asian power of consequence. You're right there in the Malacca Straits. And you will be more than just the 11th man sitting on a bench while the ASEAN countries sit and deliberate and discuss, as we've just seen over the last few days. You will actually have a very strong case for being part of ASEAN.
Yeah, right. So let's focus on, we've talked of the geography, let's focus on what has actually happened in the past in terms of our advantage at the naval front, and what could have happened during Operation Sindoor. It did not happen because the Navy's offensive role in that conflict was limited to sort of just building some pressure, but not more than that. First, what actually happened, and then we can talk about the hypotheticals of what could have happened during Operation Sindoor. 65 war, 71 war, the Kargil war. of which 71 was the one that saw the heaviest use of the Indian
Right,
Navy.
right.
65 was limited. Kargil was also some sort of offensive in terms of trying to build pressure, and like you said in the first answer, sort of ensuring that the conflict does not stay on for longer. You bring it down.
Conflict termination.
Yeah. So let's talk about 65, 71 and Kargil,
Yeah.
and especially the story you were just telling me before we began recording of how a dead cow in
Right.
65 led to the 71 bombardment
Right.
that the Navy lost.
Interesting. So 65 actually led to the Indian Navy's spectacular showing in 1971. In fact, 1971 is such a groundbreaking event for the Indian Navy. It actually saw the birth of the modern Indian Navy.
Right.
Now, there was an Indian Navy before 1971, very conservative, very British-inspired, British-influenced. You had, British surface warships, aircraft. You had admirals who were trained by the British, literally right until the 50s. And post 1971, we saw a very new, aggressive, confident Indian Navy that had actually demonstrated its, sea legs in the 71 war, and it had carried out spectacular operations. And it all begins with that, what you said is the story of the cow in 1965 in Dwarka, where this was in September, when on the night of 7th of September, there was a Pakistan surface action group comprising several warships, about half a dozen warships and a tanker, a fleet tanker. They landed up off Dwarka and they carried out a shelling. Now, Dwarka, as you know, is on the Gujarat coast, and they carried out a 30-minute bombardment, a shore bombardment of the temple town. I mean, they claimed that there was a radar station there, and they wanted to disable the radar station, but they were clearly aiming at the temple. There were about, like I mentioned, about 6 or 7 warships. They carried out a 30-minute, what is called a shore bombardment, where naval gunfire support. They shelled the town. They missed the temple, of course, but they destroyed there was a railway station and a temple there, 2 big structures along the coast, and they hit one of the buildings of the railway station. They destroyed the shed, and it so happens that there was a cow in the vicinity who was killed in that shelling. And so there was a big debate, after this incident. Now, the tragedy was that you had what was then the most powerful frigate in Asia, possibly, that was anchored just 30 kilometers north of Dwarka, in a place called Okha. You're from Gujarat, you know the geography, right? Just up the coast. You had the INS Talwar that was there that night, and which was actually picking up this Pakistani naval group that was there, this surface action group, because they were transmitting. And the Talwar was intercepting these messages. And it so happened that war had already begun by then. The India-Pakistan war was in full swing. The 1st of September is when Pakistan launched its armored thrust towards Akhnur, where they wanted to actually sever the land links between Jammu and Kashmir and India. It was Field Marshal Ayub Khan's big play at grabbing Jammu and Kashmir by force, because he saw that window of opportunity closing after India began its rearmament post 1962. This was Ayub's plan. So there was a sea leg operation. This was Operation Dwarka that they launched. Was meant to actually. It's a very carefully thought out plan. It's a tactically sounded very good on paper. The idea was that this surface action group would go there, shell the coastal town, destroy this invisible radar that nobody's seen, and draw out the Indian Navy from Bombay, which is several hundred kilometers south.
Yeah.
And they had positioned the PNS Ghazi, which is the only submarine then on the Indian subcontinent. It's a US-loaned Tench-class submarine, very powerful, undersea combatant for its time in the 60s. It's built to do battle with the Japanese in the Second World War. So the Ghazi was positioned off Mumbai, and the idea was that they would lure the Indian fleet, and as the fleet came out to go and do battle of Gujarat, the Ghazi would torpedo them. Now, 2 things happened. The Talwar didn't join the battle because the Navy was not part of the conflict. It had been actually expressly there was a signal which mentioned that the Indian Navy was not to join this conflict, the India-Pakistan war. And the second part is, of course, the Navy didn't sail out of Bombay because they were deployed elsewhere on exercises. So there was a lot of, after this happened and the Pak Navy turned back, they declared the 8th of September is officially Pakistan Navy Day for destroying a building and killing a cow. They claim it as a big, spectacular victory, and and Karachi is just 50 or 60 nautical miles away. So there was a big debate within the Navy, which said, "Oh, what did they do? They just killed a cow." But there were a very different set of individuals, very bright admirals, then captains, who took affront to this attack. Vice Admiral Krishnan, then Captain Mihir Roy, they were outraged. They said, how could Pakistan come here, carry out this bombardment? And so what? If it's just a cow that they killed, let's build a memorial to that cow, and we can say that the cow died with her hoofs on. That's what Mickey Roy said. That was Admiral Krishnan. Now, Mickey Roy's had a very roundabout way of looking at it. He said he invoked the legend of Admiral Byng, or how do you pronounce it, Byng, who had been executed by the Royal Navy because he didn't sail out and do battle with the French fleet. And he said that, he hinted at the fact that the commanding officer of the INS Talwar should have sailed out and done battle with the Pakistan Surface Action Group. Now, even today, more than 60 years later, you ask the Indian Navy, there is a division down the line about the Talwar incident. There's one set of people who will tell you, look, we had to obey orders. Navies cannot just seek out battle and, act as Rambo forces. Whereas the another group will say, look, it is in the Navy's charter to go and defend your coastline, irrespective of the fact whether war has been called or not. The CO of the INS Talwar, the commanding officer, should have gone out and done battle with the Pakistan Surface Action Group. So what if he's just one ship and there are 7 facing him? He could have fired. He had far better, guns than the Pakistanis. Those were Second World War vintage ships. His was a very modern warship. It was a British-built frigate that had been acquired just about 5 or 6 years prior, late 50s. This was a chance for the Indian Navy to prove its mettle, and this guy stayed out of battle. Now, what this does is, to the Navy, is that you had a very bright bunch of officers, very, very aggressive, ambitious, like Admiral Krishnan. Don't forget Admiral Nanda, who was a chief in 1971. Then Captain Mickey Roy, who said, we've got to do something. If we don't get the Indian Navy to fight in the 1971 war, we might as well be what is called in the Navy a force in being or a fleet in being. Now, a fleet in being is a pejorative in the Navy. It is a fleet that exists during peacetime, but in wartime is in ports and harbors. It's bottled up. It doesn't sail out because it knows that if it sails out, it will be instantly vaporized.
Yeah.
So a bit like what possibly the Talwar thought during 65. It's a matter of perception, really. Now, in 71, so the Navy went in, all guns blazing. Admiral Nanda had this plan set before the war began, somewhere in the middle of 1971. They said that, look, we are going to attack Karachi. And he grew up in Karachi, Admiral Nanda, on this Manora Island. He spent his early years there. He knew Karachi like the back of his hand. They got their new missile boats acquired from the Soviet Union. The missile boats didn't have the range to go all the way to Karachi and come back to Bombay or even Gujarat, which is why the Navy then towed these boats, as in they would tie them behind another frigate. They would launch them off Karachi. They would carry out the attack, and then these missile boats would come back on their own steam. Now, when Pakistan looked at the missile boats and their acquisition by the Indian Navy, they said these guys don't have the range. They can't go all the way up to Karachi and back. And Admiral Nanda proved them wrong. So in a span of 30 minutes off Karachi, on the night of 4th December, the Indian missile boats went in. And in less than 30 minutes, they had sunk a destroyer. They'd sunk a minesweeper, disabled another destroyer that was escorting, guess what, an ammunition ship that was bringing ammunition and spares from the US military for the Pakistan military. under cover of darkness. So in 30 minutes, there were blazing wrecks all around Karachi. All of these were missiles that were fired by our missile boats. It is then and until today, it is the most devastating naval missile engagement in history.
Okay.
Missile to, an anti-ship missile to hitting another missile. There's never been so many combatants that have been destroyed in the span of 30 minutes. And a few days later, you had Operation Python, where one missile boat, the INS Vikrant, fired 4 missiles at Karachi. Again, 3 merchant ships were knocked out, and then the tanker, PNS Dhaka, that was there was destroyed. So 2 attacks on Karachi, and you've sunk something like 8 ships. 7 destroyed, 1 completely damaged. And 3 of those ships happened to be those that took part in the shelling of Dwarka in 1965. So it was like, the Navy kind of avenging, if you can say, that the attack on Karachi in 1965. So it is one of those things that, maybe what if the Pakistan Navy had not struck in 65? Then possibly the Indian Navy would have possibly taken it easy in 71 as well, and not sprung into action. Now, the East, what happened? The Vikrant moved in. It cut off the seaward escape of the Pakistan garrison. That garrison collapsed. Literally, all of them had to surrender because there was no way of escaping. Then you had this Operation X, which was this covert maritime guerrilla war, which I have a book on, which actually went in before the war began. It was a covert operation where the governments will not take ownership of that, but these operations began in August, 4 months before the actual war began, and like 100,000 tons of shipping inside of East Pakistan, then East Pakistan, was either sunk or disabled. So you look at these 3 big major operations, the missile boat attacks on Karachi, the paralyzing of the sea lanes of communication in East Pakistan by Operation X, and of course the Vikrant Surface Action Group. And don't forget the Ghazi sinking off Vishakhapatnam. The Navy claims that it was the INS Rajput that sank the Ghazi. We don't know exactly what happened, but the end result is that the Ghazi exploded, sank, almost 100 crew died. So a very comprehensive naval defeat of Pakistan by the Indian Navy. And that's why I call 71 the birth of the modern Indian Navy.
Yeah, right. Very interesting. Now, all this happened in a time when both India and Pakistan were not nuclear powers.
Right.
Now the two are. Which brings me to Operation Sindoor and why perhaps the government would have thought several times over before deciding on using the Navy for an offensive in an offensive role, whether that was the bombardment of the Karachi port. By the way, Karachi port, pity the location here. It's just so close to India. I mean, it's just very strategically very, very bad location. But anyway, so whether it's the bombardment of the Karachi port or whether it's an economic blockade, because like you've said previously on this podcast, that Pakistan has underlined 4 red lines, where it says that if those lines are crossed, that is when it would consider launching a nuclear weapon. And one of them is the economic strangulation of Pakistan, which would happen if the Indian Navy were to successfully blockade the Pakistani coast or even the Karachi port, because like you said, 99-95% of all its trade and oil comes through that. So do you think during Kargil and during Operation Sindoor, the reason the Navy was not used in a more offensive role was this thinking that was in mind of the Indian military planners? And if we were to ever use it, what do you think would happen on that escalation ladder?
Well, if you look at it in the past operations, we've not even used the Air Force, if you look at it. After the attack on Parliament 2001, there were some very nascent plans for striking at terror launch pads and all that, but only in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. And there was, of course, during Kargil also, there was talk of, prior to that, 3 years prior to that, there was talk of going in and striking at targets across the line of control and across the international border as well. But these didn't happen. The conflicts were confined. The government of the day, in fact, gave them very strict orders that no air operations were to happen across Trans-LOC. All of those, nothing was to happen. So I think it was still not very confident, especially given the fact that you had a nuclearized subcontinent in 1998. But what we are seeing now, Dave, is a very different political leadership that has risk-taking ability, that understands the escalation ladder and the calibrated use of force. That's very important because not every action, not every skirmish, not every surgical strike will lead to a nuclear attack. So if you've noticed that from 2016 onwards, beginning with the cross-border so-called surgical strikes, which I actually call cross-border commando raids, but the fact is that there was signaling that we have done smaller operations like this in the past, but this is the first time in 2016 that we signaled, where the DGMO came out and gave out a statement saying that yes, we did carry out these attacks on launch pads. So it was the government of India signaling intent. 2019, you saw the Indian Air Force being used for the first time to attack a target in mainland Pakistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where they struck that camp in Balakot, Jabba Top. And in 2025, where again the Air Force was the instrument of first resort.
Yeah.
The Air Force, and of course backed by some artillery as well. These were very, very significant milestones in the fact that the government has understood calibrated force and the escalation ladder. And they decided that the Navy would come in at stage 3 or 4, stage 4 or 5 or beyond that. So initially it was all Army and Air Force actions, but if you look at it, the Navy would have been possibly after the 10th of May. And it's very clear indications. We don't know for a fact. We know that there was a very carefully thought out escalation ladder that the government and the military had worked out. That was alluded to by Vice Admiral Pramod when he mentioned that there was an escalation ladder. And it's quite possible, given the fact that you had the entire Vikrant surface action group there of Pakistan with all its warships, all of them armed with BrahMos missiles, there's a very fair possibility that the next strike after the 10th would have come from the sea. And this would again have been from warships firing at either Pakistani warships or certain installations over there. But, telling Pakistan, reminding them of the vulnerability of the maritime boundary, of their maritime frontier, and the fact that how high do you want to go up the escalation ladder? We are prepared to climb that. And that would achieve that kind of escalation dominance, which would force Pakistan then to kind of de-escalate. So it was, very calibrated use of the Air Force and the Navy. Now, the Army, for very obvious reasons, was not used because a lot of chatter came out at that time. Oh, you didn't, POK is still there. You haven't captured POK. But the idea of the operation was not to liberate POK or to capture Gilgit-Baltistan or to link up with Afghanistan. It had a very definite set of aims, which the government then decided on the 10th that we have achieved what we wanted to do, and therefore let us now de-escalate. But the reason why you're talking about all of this now is that then the narrative kind of spun out of control, and that entered a very different dimension, which is why the sixth dimension that we've not seen, in any previous conflict, at least to this level, which is the narrative warfare realm, became super active, and that's going on till date. If you look at it with President Trump's statements and what the Pakistani leadership has been talking about. But be that as it may, the fact is that the government achieved its objectives. They wanted to punish Pakistan for that Pahalgam terror attack, horrible terror attack where civilians were massacred, very brutally, cold-blooded fashion. They wanted to, send out a message to Pakistan not to sponsor terrorism. That was what the whole objective was. And then over the next couple of days, that we slowly went up an escalation ladder and then de-escalated on the 10th. So the fact is that when you have an air force that is able to inflict such heavy damage on the Pakistan Air Force by destroying all its airfields, forcing them to operate off runways or moving into your depth bases, you have a navy that has the ability to convert Pakistan into a landlocked state, right? You can forget about that's the messaging. You can forget about your 1,000-kilometer long coastline. Yeah. You will become a landlocked state like Afghanistan. You will not have the use of the sea or the coastline or your sea lanes of communication in the duration of this conflict. So that is the kind of signaling that I see as having come out. And this is something that we've hinted at in the past. In 2001, when you had the Op Parakram mobilization. Before that, you had Kargil as well, of course, where the Indian Navy was mobilized off the coast of Pakistan. But it is only in 2025 that we've seen this force accretion being part of an escalation ladder, where the leadership in GHQ Rawalpindi is clearly looking at it. Look, this is what happened on day 1, this is what happened on day 2, this is what happened on day 3. Day 4, I might lose whatever is left of my air bases or my radar cover. Day 5, I might lose my maritime boundary. They may not physically blockade it, to in a way that was done in a full-scale war in 71, but they would harass my shipping. They would not allow my warships to sail out. They would become targets instantly. So thereby, skirting these red lines that Khalid Kidwai mentioned, that short of a full-scale economic blockade, that would only play out possibly in a full-scale war. But in a conflict like this, I would call it a special military operation. Sindoor was not exactly a war. It was a very unusual kind of a conflict that we saw both sides not crossing each other's borders. Your favorite line, not cross borders without a passport, right? So no one crossed borders. They had standoff missile attacks, right? So this is a new kind of war fighting, and I think it is in this kind of war fighting where you're looking at not waging wars of attrition, where the Air Force becomes really important, where the Navy becomes really important.
Yeah, right. So, then it would seem that it's all hunky-dory with the Indian Navy, but there's a big but over here, and that's something I want to discuss, but after a quick break.
So what is this? Is this that Punjabi Muslim arrogance that comes that theek hai, maar diya to maar diya, Pashtuno ko maar diya to maar diya?
I think there's a kind of hubris that Punjab is Pakistan, that the other ethnicities and the other provinces are much smaller, and really they don't at the end of the day matter.
Because of population.
Because of population, resources, the army's main recruiting grounds are still Punjab, the officer class is still Punjabi. There are a number of other officers, Pashtuns, etc. But at the end of the day, it's Punjab. And I know because I've been told by some Pakistani retired officers, of course, that Musharraf, you mentioned him earlier in the conversation, that Musharraf was always very conscious of his Muhajir background. Yes. And therefore he tried to compensate it. To my mind, he tried to compensate it by being even more aggressive towards us.
But tell me something, you spoke of hubris. Is Pakistan, and especially under Asim Munir, I would love to know from you, what is your reading of Asim Munir? Right now, even Musharraf was very careful, or all Pakistani generals are very careful that nothing should happen in Pakistan's Punjab province. So when Kargil war that I covered, NLI troops were killed, they were all from POJK and, also northern areas. So they didn't mind 200, 300 being buried by India or 800 dying. It was okay for them. The only body they asked for, you were JS spy even that time.
Sher Khan.
Sher Khan. When they sought a body of a Pakistani officer who was killed and buried by India, they said exhume him and return it to us, because he was apparently from Pakistan's Punjab province.
No, that was also because the Indian, and this was the professionalism of the Indian army, that the Indian commander who was commanding the place where Sher Khan was fighting praised his bravery and valor.
In fact, I reported it that time.
And he said when the Pakistani plane came and to take his body, along with the coffin, he sent a letter to the commander of Sher Khan's unit praising his valor.
Welcome back. Sandeep, what we've discussed before the break would warm the hearts of many.
Yeah.
But there is a big but. like I said before taking the break, and that but comes because of China, and that's
Yeah.
something that you sort of alluded to at the end of a recording very recently, where you said, "Ki, but this is not where we should be looking
Yeah.
because this is something that we have sorted, that we
Right.
have got sorted. One, thanks to our geographical advantage, what
Yeah.
we discussed in the first half, and then second, thanks to the sort of tactics you're able to develop and sort of how
Yeah.
you're able to use that space to your advantage." The real focus should always be China, and that's what we've been seeing of in the last few years. China is rapidly expanding its navy. It's now bigger than the US Navy in terms of the number of ships.
Right.
But technologically, obviously, the US Navy is far, far, far
Yeah.
ahead. There's no match, obviously. You've had Chinese so-called research vehicles coming towards the Bay of Bengal, especially during times when India is sort of testing a missile or is issuing a no time to test a missile. They've been making those forays. There have been reports of Chinese submarines also sort of lurking around in that area. I don't want to ask the question of how does the Indian Navy match up to the Chinese Navy, because that would be a very, ki itna ships hai, itna ships nahi
Right.
hai.
The bean count.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I'd rather do it in the map analogy that we
Yeah.
began this episode with. So you look at the map now. You look
Yeah.
that if Bay of Bengal is our backyard, there is only one place where you can sort of threaten or harass China, which is South China Sea or the East China Sea, slightly
Right,
higher up.
right.
We'll have the map for our viewers, so it's easier for them to understand. Now, if we were to talk about the Indian Navy strengths, the way I would ask you this question now
Yeah.
is, does the Indian Navy right now possess the ability or the capability to pop up
Right.
in South China Sea or even East China Sea?
Yeah.
And if it does not, what does it need to do that, to get that? And does it want to do that?
Well, so Dave, if the naval leadership has taken its cue from the political leadership, which has articulated India's area of influence as being from the Gulf of Aden right at the Straits of Malacca. Now, the Navy, in its present form, with all its platforms, all its combatants, is more than adequate for this area of influence, where you have your twin carrier battle groups. The Navy's maritime strategy revolves around aircraft carriers. You have the Vikrant and you have the Vikramaditya, which have their own escort ships. They have submarines and all of that. So these are fit for this existing area of influence from the Gulf of Aden to the Malacca Straits. Now, Malacca Straits are important because you have the Malacca Straits, then you have the Ombai Vetar, the Sunda and the Lombok Straits. These four straits are going to be used by the PLA Navy to enter the Indian Ocean. And they've been doing that over the last nearly 16 or 17 years that they've been deployed in the anti-piracy patrols of the Red Sea. They've used it to expand their influence, to test their readiness to forward deploy in the Indian Ocean region, because more than 60% of their energy supplies flow through the Persian Gulf. And they're very worried about the safety of these being disrupted in conflict, possibly with the United States. So they've been forward positioning their ships and building up their sea legs. Now, if the PLA Navy were to come in strength, the Indian Navy's strategy, my understanding would be to tackle them at the choke points,
right.
at Malacca, at Sunda, Lombok, Ombai Vetar. Now, if you were to go beyond these choke points, then you would need a whole new set of combatants. Your existing warships would not be adequate. Then you would need a very large force of nuclear-powered attack submarines, because nuclear-powered attack submarines, or SSNs as they're called, they are the only combatants that can operate on their own in enemy waters, in contested waters. Because, conventional submarines, I call conventional submarines, they're actually submersibles. And no offense meant to all my friends out there on the conventional boats, they're doing a great job. But they are limited by their design, by their diesel-electric propulsion. Even if they have air-independent propulsion, they're submersibles. They go out, they sail, they're submerged for a certain number of days, and then they have to resurface for air. Whereas a nuclear-powered attack submarine is not limited by any of this. In fact, it's only limited by the food on board, carried on board, or by the endurance of the crew. Because that nuclear reactor gives you unlimited power. You can stay underwater almost indefinitely. And it is a platform like this which is able to carry a very large weapon load of torpedoes, anti-ship missiles, and land attack cruise missiles that has the ability to significantly influence the maritime battle and also the battle on land. So if you look at it, the US Navy has something like more than 50 nuclear-powered attack submarines. It has more nuclear-powered attack submarines than the rest of the world put together. And that is how they exercise sea control. And they dominate the oceans of the world. So if India were to go beyond the barrier, I call it, of the Malacca Straits, it will have to build up a larger force of nuclear-powered attack submarines. Now, we have one that's, we've had this very unique arrangement with first the USSR and then later with the Russian Federation to lease one such
Chakra.
The Chakra 1, then we had the Chakra 2, and now we have the Chakra 3 that will be inducted towards the end of this decade. But that's not enough because you would need a force of something like 6 of these submarines at the very minimum, because you would have to assume that if you have 6 boats, only 3 or 4 of them would be operational at any given time. The others would be under refit maintenance. And the government has cleared a proposal for building 2 of these, but they're still on the design stage and they will not enter service at least until the late 2030s, more than a decade from now, 10, 15 years. That's how long it takes to build these boats. They're very complex platforms. They're over 12,000 tons in displacement. They're very difficult to master, the technology to build them. The reactor is a completely different beast. The reactor that takes them to such great speeds of more than 20, 25, 30 knots even. Those have to be specially designed, constructed for the massive burst of speed that it needs. So these platforms will come in only in the late 2030s. But, I don't like getting into this thing of, being a platform-centric Navy. I think you need to network your existing assets and look for other ways that you can project power, if need be, across these, the barriers of these choke points. And, coming to the Chinese Navy that you mentioned, that they are growing in numbers. But let's not forget that the PLA Navy is not the only one that could strike at the Indian Navy. It could be the PLA Air Force as well. Yeah. They have a long-range bomber fleet. They have long-range ballistic missiles, anti-ship ballistic missiles. So the threat could come not just from PLA Navy warships or submarines. They could be from the long-range bomber fleet. They could be from their anti-ship ballistic missile fleet as well. So there's a lot of things that the Indian Navy, needs to look out for when it comes to fighting an adversary or deterring an adversary. Let's say that's the more politically correct way of saying it. Deterring an adversary like China from imposing its will on us in the Indian Ocean.
Yeah. Right. And this all harks back to the episode on submarines that we did and what you describe as the lost decade, because of the inaction that you did in the previous decade, you will have nothing in the near future, which is exactly what happened with the nuclear powered attack submarines. Right. Something that the Navy had envisioned long back, but it just never saw
25 years
light
back,
of day, except now that it's happening. And I think also a big part of what you said, especially the part about India wanting to not limit per se, but India not seeing more than, like you said, the Gulf of Aden and the Malacca Straits, because I think it also again goes back to what you briefly said, that we don't really have an expansionist mindset. Yes. We just want to live peacefully. But a lot of these, the entire question, the question that I asked you, that can we pop up in the South China Sea, only happens because that would be when China is needling you. If there was no China needling you, you would not need to even envision that.
Well, I'll answer your question, Dave. I mean, there has been one such pop-up or no pop-up in the South China Sea. There's only one naval unit that has operated in the South China Sea in a condition of conflict or a impending conflict or a standoff with China, and that is the Indian Navy's Chakra 2. I've written about this in the past. This is during the Doklam standoff a couple of years back, is when the Indian Navy deployed the INS Chakra as a proof of concept to see if the Chakra could operate in contested enemy waters. And from all accounts, that was an extremely successful deployment where they validated a number of concepts that a nuclear submarine could not only target warships out at in enemy harbors, but also attack targets on land. So, that is a very important deployment. It's not in the public domain yet. From those who know about it, they know about it.
Wow, that's very, very interesting. And I'm pretty sure China knows about it, and it must have gotten quite the scare.
Yes.
Wow, fantastic. Right. Cool. We'll end this episode there. But before we go, one quick sort of tangent on the topic of navies and this legend that's there around the 71 war. And I just want your brains on what do we know of what actually happened. Is the legend of the US sending its 7th Fleet into the Bay of Bengal? And Russia rushing some of its surface ships and one submarine to scare them off.
Yes.
What has happened, unfortunately, is that over a period of time, this has just been embellished, and it's come to a stage where I don't know what actually happened back then, and how real was the threat of the Seventh Fleet sort of, potentially engaging with the Indian Navy, and did the Russians actually, sort of intercede and sort of, scare the US Navy off? So, what do you know of what exactly has happened?
Well, it's a fact that the U.S. Navy did deploy. It was President Nixon and his National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, who saw the way things were playing out.
They didn't like Indira Gandhi.
And they hated Indira Gandhi, of course, and they saw the East Pakistan collapsing. Now, the idea was to send the USS Enterprise, which is then the most powerful naval platform in the world. It was a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. It carried 60, 70 aircraft on board, and it had a USS Tripoli, which was a landing platform dock ship, which carried Marines, almost 1,000 Marines, and its escort ships as well. There are half a dozen escorts. So it was a very powerful flotilla of ships. It was, I think it was Carrier Strike Group. It was Task Force 74, if I remember correctly, and it was headed by a very bright US admiral whose name will come to me. They were sailing out of Vietnam and they were pushed across into the Bay of Bengal. The idea was to send India a message. It was gunboat diplomacy, exactly of the kind that you see off the coast of Venezuela. That's playing out right now, right? The US has deployed more warships off the coast of Venezuela. The first time that it's deployed so many warships in the Caribbean since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. So the US fleet did deploy there, and what the Soviets did at that time was Admiral Gorshkov, the legendary Admiral Gorshkov. He sent a Soviet fleet to tail the Americans, and it so happened that the submarines that were tailing the USS Enterprise, and this was something that they did as a matter of courtesy during the Cold War, that you had US fleets that were shadowed or tailed by Russian submarines, and you had American submarines tailing the Soviets. And it so happens that it was 2 or 3 ships and 2 submarines, if I remember correctly the number. They were asked by the Soviets to surface so that the US Navy could see them. So you saw the prospect of the US 7th Fleet actually sailing into the Indian Ocean, and they did this big loop around the Indian Ocean, and they realized that the game was up in East Pakistan, and they had no option but to withdraw. But the interesting thing is that what happened when the news of this flotilla heading towards East Pakistan, it actually brought in a lot of confidence in the garrison there, where General Niazi, who was holding out, actually believed that they were coming to his rescue. And he was all set for that evacuation that would be done under the supervision of the Americans. Indian political leadership got spooked a bit by that, of course. Who isn't spooked by a massive flotilla of that size? Which is why possibly they leaned on the Soviets to do their bit, which the Soviets complied. But if you see the way the 7th Fleet then quickly turned around and went back. And now, interestingly, Henry Kissinger was here for the India Today conclave many years back, and I was his liaison person, and I spent a lot of time with him. And I asked him, Dr. Kissinger, he said, yes, it's that question which every Indian asks me. Yes, go ahead, ask me this. So I said, why did you send the 7th Fleet in? So he said this, and he said, look, it wasn't meant to prevent the fall of East Pakistan. We knew that East Pakistan was a goner. It was to signal to the Indian political leadership that do not move into the West. They were very worried that not only was the East, not only had the East fallen, but now India would take the battle into the West.
Right.
And they would, humiliate Pakistan. They would capture territory over there. They would destabilize the thing to a point where the US could not have a viable client or a satellite state in the form of Pakistan. And we actually agreed. We said, look, this much and no further. And there was no major thrust into the West. So there was a section of the Indian political leadership, the military leadership, that believed that we should have transferred our forces back to the West and continued the battle over there and defeated, recaptured parts of Haji Pir or, POK. We could have taken away territory there. But that option was lost because there was a ceasefire in the West. There was, of course, another small part of the military leadership as well, which I've spoken to, actually thought of contingency planning. What would they do if the Americans actually entered the Bay of Bengal? That we would have to fly one-way missions because they didn't have the reach or the range at that time. Their fighter jets would have to fly one-way missions to attack the American fleet, because if they entered there, they would then target the Vikrant carrier strike group that was there in the North Bay of Bengal. So the Air Force would have to be pulled in. But of course, this didn't come to pass. These were just, ideas in people's imagination, because the US 7th Fleet then just did that quick thing and went back. So it's a fact that the US did deploy. It was gunboat diplomacy, and it is gunboat diplomacy of Venezuela. But that's how the way of the world is when the United States is. It is the strong do as they please, and the weak have to just bear it.
Yeah, right. Great. We'll end the episode there. Thanks, Sandeep. Fantastic chat as always. Had lots of fun.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thanks for having me, Dev.
Yeah. And thanks as always to our listeners and viewers. That's it for this week's Defense Dose. For more, tune in next week. Till then, stay safe and do not cross any boundaries without a passport.